what we call modern science, or which you could almost call super science, not the notebook jottings of naturalists and the collated accounts of travelers, but big science, where millions, hundreds of millions of dollars are spent on instruments and coordinated teams of people attack problem. This style of science that has grown up in the 20th century has had a very interesting consequence, which, because it is spread out over more than a generation, we all have grown up with it and haven't really realized what an unusual situation we are living in. We are living in a state of constant scientific revolution. There is not a single area that you can name that is now seen as it was seen, let's pick a number, 100 years ago. Nothing is left of the worldview of 100 years ago. 100 years ago, atoms were billiard balls, the basic building block of the universe, indivisible. 100 years ago, the position of biology was that Darwinian mechanics had just been enunciated in the 1850s and was making its way against an orthodoxy which held that the Earth had been created in 4004 BC. Less than 100 years ago, when the cave paintings at Lascaux and Altamira in southern France and Spain were first discovered, and experts came from Paris to view them. After looking the caves over, the experts announced that these paintings were obviously done by soldiers in the army of Napoleon who had overwintered there in 1816 and 17. So I'll give a few of these examples. Continental drift was unknown. The fact that the continent of Africa had an edge which fit exactly against the continent of South America was mentioned in textbooks as an example of God's sense of humor. It was not seen to signal anything. I can't think of an area in science where we have retained the vision that we had then. The Earth was thought to be ultimately stable, pretty much as it had been on the day of creation, even by the British geologists who were reacting against the story of biblical creation. But there's one area where surprisingly little has happened, and it is, strangely enough, the area of the human mind. Strides were made in the early part of the 20th century by describing the unconscious, but it's important to remember that some of the hottest therapies that pass through a place like Esalen, which would be things like hypnotherapy, mesmerism. Mesmerism had its great heyday in the 1890s of the last century. Colonic therapy, brought to a peak in Germany in the 1870s. Reflexology, a 19th century theory. Homeopathy, a theory developed in the late 19th, early 20th century. So we've not had in place really new models of the mind. The body, because of Wilhelm Reich and the many, many schools that he spawned either as his progeny or in reaction to his thought, have given us new handles on the relationship of psychology to the body. But in the area of the mind, it's been pretty much left alone. Well, now, to go back to the previous example of these other areas where scientific revolutions were made, they were true revolutions. They were not fine-tunings or little additions of details, but complete overthrow of old paradigms and the establishment of new ones. The Earth went from being a solid body with continents pretty much in the same places since creation to a complex system of convection flows where continents are brought together and broken apart. Man, instead of being seen as the highest product of creation, a descent slightly beneath the angels, is instead seen as a primate, a specialized monkey of a certain sort. The hard atoms, the indivisible atoms of 19th century physics give way to fields, first of all, fields which are characterized by action at a distance, which had always been excluded previously. I mean, reason dictated that action at a distance was a kind of superstition. Then James Clerk Maxwell demonstrated that these fields really exist. So in each of these areas, a total revolution took place. Now, the reason that psychology was immune to this, I think, was because we did not have the tools to advance it. They came to us out of ethnography and anthropology, out of the work of Wasson and Hoffman, and earlier Havelock Ellis and Weir Mitchell, Henri Michaud, all the people who worked with psychedelics. At first it was worked with by artists, by literary people, by people who were interested in expanding their own sensation. But slowly it came to be realized that it was an insight into the mind, not into the nature of it so much, which I think still remains a mystery, but simply into its size, that the mind is a far bigger domain than we ever imagined. We have somehow the idea that the mind is in the head. It's made by the brain, and therefore it must be a smaller and less inclusive domain than the domain in which it is embedded. But I brought along an example here. This is a box, and this box has in it a box that is exactly the same size as it is. This demonstrates how even in three-dimensional reality, expectation can be confounded.
This is a toy of Finn, our son.
This, which is inside the box,
Looks like.
is itself a box, indistinguishable from this one.
And then this one.
And then that
That
one
one.
goes in there like that
You know how there it goes.
and can be closed into this. Now that's what we're here to talk about.
The Möbius cube.
It's just how to do that, how to take a world with a world in it and put it into the world in it and put the world in it outside of it. Because what we're talking about and what history is, I think, is an effort to exteriorize the soul and interiorize the body, to make the fields of the Lord that we all sense inside us meadows that we can actually throw our clothes off and wander into. I think really what unites psychedelic people is the faith in the power of the imagination. And science, when it examines the psychedelics, as it will and must, is going to discover a revolution, I believe, that will put all the previous revolutions in perspective and will show that they were merely anticipations of finding out this final unimaginable fact about nature. Nature, whenever you scratch its surface, has aspects that are unanticipated. So when they looked at the shape of the continents, they discovered continental drift. When Wallace and Darwin looked at the distribution of butterflies over Indonesian islands, they suddenly had a vision of the origin of species and how that worked. The psychedelics are this immense tool for the inspection of our own nature. And when we scratch it, when we bring that tool to apply, we are not going to recognize ourselves.